The Montana plains stretched endlessly beneath a sky so vast it seemed to swallow the earth whole. Rolling grasslands painted in shades of emerald and gold rippled like ocean waves in the persistent wind that never seemed to rest. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Here, where the Yellowstone River carved its ancient path through the territory, the buffalo herd still ran thick enough to shake the ground for miles around. Sarah Mitchell had never imagined she would find herself in such a place, standing on the wooden platform of this small trading post that served as the only connection between the civilized world and this wild frontier. The year was 1878, and Montana Territory was still a land where survival depended more on courage than comfort, more on wisdom than wealth. The morning sun cast long shadows across the settlement of Riverside Bend, a collection of rough log buildings that had sprung up where the river made a sweeping curve toward the north. She pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders as she watched the horizon, searching for any sign of the supply wagon that should have arrived 3 days ago. As the newest schoolteacher in this remote outpost, Sarah had quickly learned that schedules meant little when nature held the final word. Storms could delay travelers for weeks, and broken axles or lame horses could strand a wagon train hundreds of miles from help. The trading post behind her buzzed with the morning activity of trappers, ranchers, and the occasional drifter seeking supplies or shelter. She could hear the deep voices of men discussing weather patterns, animal tracks, and the constant challenge of making a living in country that tested every soul brave enough or foolish enough to call it home. Among those voices, one stood out with a resonance that seemed to command attention without effort. Thomas Running Bear was impossible to ignore, though Sarah had tried her best to do exactly that since arriving in Riverside Bend 6 weeks earlier. Standing nearly 7 feet tall with shoulders broad enough to block doorways, he moved through the trading post with the quiet confidence of someone completely at home in his surroundings. His long black hair was often tied back with leather strips, and his dark eyes held an intelligence that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing of his own thoughts. The other settlers spoke of him with a mixture of respect and wariness that Sarah had come to understand was common when cultures met on the frontier. Thomas was Apache, though he had traveled far from his ancestral lands to hunt the great buffalo herds that still roamed the northern plains. He worked as a guide and hunter for wagon trains, using his knowledge of the land to lead travelers safely through territories that could be deadly for the unprepared. Sarah had been warned about him, of course. Well-meaning women in the settlement had quietly advised her to keep her distance, to remember her position as a respectable schoolteacher, and to avoid any situations that might compromise her reputation. But their warnings had only served to increase her curiosity about the man who seemed to bridge two worlds with such apparent ease. She had observed him from a distance, noting how he interacted with both white settlers and the occasional Native Americans who came to trade at the post. He spoke multiple languages fluently, switching between English, Apache, and what she assumed was Crow or Blackfoot, depending on his audience. His manner was always courteous but reserved, as if he maintained careful boundaries between himself and others. This morning, however, Thomas was nowhere to be seen among the usual crowd gathered around the trading post. Sarah found herself scanning the settlement more thoroughly than necessary, telling herself she was simply taking note of who was present for practical reasons. As the schoolteacher, she needed to know which children might be expected in class, and which families might need assistance with various community matters. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew Sarah's attention back to the eastern horizon, where a cloud of dust was rising against the morning sky. Her heart lifted with hope that the supply wagon had finally arrived, bringing the books and materials she desperately needed for her students. Teaching in a frontier settlement meant making do with whatever resources could be obtained, and every delivery was precious. But as the riders drew closer, Sarah realized this was not the merchant wagon she had been expecting. 3 men on horseback were approaching at a pace that suggested urgency rather than the steady progress of traders. Even from a distance, she could see that their clothes were travel-worn and their horses showed signs of hard riding. Behind them, barely visible against the grassland, moved what appeared to be a much larger group. Samuel Henderson, the trading post owner, emerged from his store and shaded his eyes with one weathered hand as he studied the approaching riders. Henderson was a practical man in his 50s who had survived 2 decades on the frontier by developing an instinct for trouble. Sarah had learned to read his expressions, and the frown creasing his features now suggested that these visitors might not be entirely welcome. "Miss Mitchell," Henderson called to her, his voice carrying a note of caution she had never heard before. "You might want to step inside for a few minutes while we see what these fellows want." Sarah's independent nature bristled at the suggestion that she should hide simply because strangers were approaching. She had come to Montana Territory precisely because she wanted to experience life beyond the confined expectations of Eastern society. Hiding at the first sign of the unknown seemed to defeat the purpose of her adventure. "I'm perfectly fine where I am, Mr. Henderson," she replied, though she did move closer to the trading post entrance. "I'm curious to see who's traveling through our area." The lead rider pulled his horse to a stop near the platform where Sarah stood, and she immediately understood Henderson's concern. The man was clearly a drifter of the worst sort, with pale eyes that seemed to catalog everything around him as potential prophet or threat. His companions looked equally unsavory, and all 3 men bore the kind of weapons that suggested they made their living through intimidation rather than honest work. "Morning, folks," the leader called out, his voice carrying a false friendliness that fooled no one. "Name's Jake Coulter. We're looking for information about a particular individual who might have passed through this area recently." Henderson stepped forward, positioning himself between the strangers and Sarah. "We see a lot of travelers through here. Might help if you could be more specific about who you're seeking." Coulter's pale eyes fixed on Sarah for a moment, before returning to Henderson. "Big Apache fellow, goes by the name Thomas Running Bear. We heard he guides wagon trains through this territory, and we've got business with him." Sarah felt her stomach tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. There was something in Coulter's tone that suggested his business with Thomas would not be pleasant. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Henderson's expression had grown even more guarded, and she noticed several other men from the settlement beginning to gather nearby, their hands resting casually near their weapons. "Can't say I recall anyone by that name," Henderson replied carefully. "Like I said, we see a lot of folks passing through. Apache, white, Mexican, all kinds. Most don't bother to give their names unless they're staying for trading." It was a lie, of course, and Sarah suspected everyone present knew it. Thomas had been a regular presence at the trading post for months, and his distinctive appearance made him impossible to forget. But frontier communities had their own code of loyalty, and strangers who arrived asking threatening questions rarely received honest answers. Coulter's expression hardened slightly, though he maintained his false smile. "That's unfortunate, because we really do need to speak with him. You see, Mr. Running Bear has something that belongs to our employer, and we've been hired to retrieve it." "What kind of something?" Henderson asked, his tone suggesting he already doubted the truthfulness of the claim. "A valuable artifact that was stolen from an archaeological expedition last spring. A sacred Apache ceremonial piece that Running Bear took during a raid on our camp near the Powder River." Sarah felt her breath catch. She knew enough about frontier politics to understand that accusations of theft against Native Americans were often used to justify violence that had nothing to do with actual justice. The story sounded rehearsed, designed to give these men legal justification for whatever they intended to do to Thomas. Even if we knew this fellow, Henderson said slowly, we wouldn't be in the habit of turning over information about our neighbors to strangers making serious accusations without proof. Coulter's false friendliness finally slipped away entirely, revealing the cold calculation beneath. Proof? We've got sworn statements from 3 expedition members identifying Running Bear as the thief. That's more proof than most Apache get before they're brought to justice. The threat in his words was unmistakable, and Sarah saw several of the settlement men shift their positions slightly, preparing for the possibility that this conversation might turn violent. She found herself thinking about Thomas, wondering where he was and whether he had any idea that dangerous men were hunting him. Well then, Henderson replied with deliberate calmness, I suppose you'll want to take those sworn statements to the territorial marshal in Billings. He's the proper authority for handling theft accusations. Coulter laughed, a sound without humor. The marshal's 3 days' ride from here, and justice delayed is justice denied. We prefer to handle these matters more directly. Behind they 3 mounted men, the larger group Sarah had noticed earlier was finally close enough to see clearly. A dozen riders, all armed and organized with military precision. This was not a casual search party, but a deliberate expedition equipped for serious conflict. Looks like you brought quite a force for retrieving one stolen artifact, Henderson observed dryly. Running Bear has friends, Coulter replied. Apache warriors who might object to his being brought to justice. We came prepared for resistance. Sarah felt anger rising in her chest at the casual way these men spoke of violence against people they had never met. The frontier could be dangerous, but it also fostered a rough equality where a person's character mattered more than their race or background. Thomas had earned respect in Riverside Bend through his actions, not his ancestry, and the idea that outsiders could simply arrive and threaten him based on unproven accusations violated everything she had come to value about frontier justice. If you're so certain of your legal position, she found herself saying before she could consider the wisdom of speaking, why not wait for the proper authorities to handle the matter? All eyes turned to her, and Sarah realized she had just inserted herself into a potentially deadly confrontation. Coulter's pale gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl, and she saw him cataloging her appearance and position, just as he had done with everything else. And you are? He asked, his tone carrying implications that made Henderson step protectively closer to her. Miss Sarah Mitchell, she replied, raising her chin with determination she didn't entirely feel. I'm the schoolteacher here, and I believe in following proper legal procedures rather than vigilante justice. Coulter's smile returned, but now it held a predatory quality that made Sarah wish she had remained silent. A schoolteacher. How admirable. I'm sure you teach your students about the importance of law and order. I teach them about justice, Sarah corrected, which includes the principle that accusations must be proven before punishment is administered. An excellent principle, Coulter agreed mockingly. Unfortunately, it's not always practical in frontier situations. Sometimes justice must be swift to be effective. Henderson cleared his throat diplomatically. Gentlemen, we appreciate your position, but as I mentioned, we haven't seen the individual you're seeking. Perhaps you might have better luck checking with settlements further north. Coulter studied Henderson's face for a long moment, clearly trying to determine whether the trading post owner was telling the truth. Finally, he nodded to his companions and gathered his reins. We'll be camping just north of here for a few days while we continue our search, he announced. If anyone happens to remember seeing Thomas Running Bear, we'd appreciate the information. There might even be a reward for helpful citizens. The implied threat was clear. These men were not simply passing through but were establishing themselves in the area. They intended to wait for Thomas to return, and they expected the local population to cooperate with their plans. As the riders departed toward the northern edge of the settlement, Sarah felt the tension in the air like an approaching thunderstorm. Henderson and the other men began speaking in low voices, discussing the implications of having dangerous strangers camped nearby. She caught fragments of their conversation, references to defensive preparations, messages that needed to be sent, and the complex politics of territorial law enforcement. "Miss Mitchell," Henderson called to her as the crowd began to disperse. "I think it might be wise if you stayed close to the settlement for the next few days. These fellows don't strike me as the type to respect the safety of innocent civilians." Sarah nodded, understanding the practical wisdom of his advice, even as her independent spirit chafed against the restriction. But her thoughts were primarily focused on Thomas Running Bear and the danger that was now hunting him. She found herself wondering about the accusations Coulter had made. Were they true or simply convenient justification for violence motivated by other factors? She had observed Thomas carefully during her weeks in Riverside Bend, and nothing in his behavior suggested criminality. He was reserved but honest in his dealings, respectful to everyone regardless of their background, and clearly knowledgeable about survival in the wilderness. The children in her class who had encountered him spoke of him with the kind of casual acceptance that suggested he was simply part of their community rather than a threatening outsider. More importantly, she had begun to notice things about Thomas that had nothing to do with his reputation or his role in the community. The way he moved with unconscious grace despite his imposing size. The careful attention he paid to conversations, as if he found other people genuinely interesting. The rare occasions when she had seen him smile, usually in response to something amusing one of the children had said. Sarah realized with a start that her concern for Thomas's safety was not entirely motivated by abstract principles of justice. Somewhere during her weeks of observing him from a distance, she had developed feelings that went beyond mere neighborly concern. The thought of him facing a dozen armed men based on false accusations filled her with a fear that was entirely personal. The rest of the morning passed slowly, with an undercurrent of tension affecting everyone in the settlement. Normal activities continued, but Sarah noticed that men kept their weapons closer than usual and women gathered their children with more frequency. The presence of Coulter's group had introduced an element of unpredictability that made everyone nervous. Sarah attempted to focus on preparing lessons for her afternoon classes, but her concentration kept wandering to the northern horizon where smoke from the stranger's campfire was visible against the clear sky. She found herself constructing elaborate plans for warning Thomas if he returned, though she had no idea when that might happen or even if he intended to return to Riverside Bend at all. It was near midday when she heard the sound that changed everything. A distant rumbling that seemed to come from the earth itself, growing steadily stronger until the wooden floor of the trading post began to vibrate beneath her feet. She stepped outside and looked toward the western plains, where a sight both magnificent and terrifying was unfolding. Buffalo, thousands of them, moving in a great herd that stretched beyond the horizon. The animals were migrating south ahead of the approaching winter, following paths their ancestors had traveled for countless generations. Even from miles away, the thunder of their hooves was audible, and the dust they raised created a brown cloud that obscured the distant mountains. Other people from the settlement had emerged to watch the spectacle, pointing and calling to each other in excitement. Buffalo herds of this size were becoming increasingly rare as hunters and settlers changed the patterns of wildlife across the territory. Seeing such a massive migration was an event that would be talked about for years. But Sarah's attention was drawn to something else entirely. In the distance, barely visible against the moving mass of animals, she could see riders. Hunters who were paralleling the herd, probably seeking opportunities to harvest meat for trading posts and military settlements throughout the region. Her heart began to beat faster as she realized that Thomas Running Bear was most likely among those hunters. Buffalo hunting was his profession, and a herd of this size would represent opportunities too valuable to ignore. Which meant he was probably riding toward Riverside Bend at this very moment, unaware that dangerous men were waiting for his arrival. Sarah felt a mixture of anticipation and dread as she watched the distant figures. Soon she would see Thomas again, but the reunion would bring deadly complications that could cost him his life. She needed to find a way to warn him, but doing so would require courage she wasn't certain she possessed, and actions that would definitely compromise her position as a respectable schoolteacher. The sound of approaching horses from the north reminded her that Coulter and his men were also watching the buffalo migration. They would undoubtedly realize that the arrival of the herd might bring the man they sought, and they would be preparing accordingly. As the afternoon wore on, the buffalo herd moved closer to the settlement, and the individual hunters became more clearly visible. Sarah counted at least 8 riders working the edges of the massive migration, though the dust and distance made it difficult to distinguish individuals. She found herself studying each figure, trying to identify Thomas by his size and the way he sat his horse. Henderson approached her as she stood watching from the trading post platform. "Miss Mitchell, I think you should know that those strangers have moved their camp closer to town. They're positioned where they can observe anyone approaching from the west." Sarah nodded, her anxiety increasing. "Have you been able to send word to the territorial authorities about their presence?" "Sent a rider to Billings this morning, but even if the marshal responds immediately, it'll be 3 days before help arrives. Whatever's going to happen here will be over long before then." The implications of his words settled over Sarah like a cold wind. Thomas was riding into a trap, and there was no legal authority available to prevent whatever Coulter and his men intended to do. The rough justice of the frontier would prevail, and that justice was often determined by who had the most guns rather than who held the moral right. "Is there any way to get word to the hunters about the danger?" she asked. Henderson studied her face carefully before answering. Riding out to meet them would mean crossing open ground where Coulter's men could see everything. Whoever attempted it would be putting themselves at considerable risk. Sarah understood. He was telling her that warning Thomas was possible, but would require someone to voluntarily place themselves in deadly danger. It was not something that could be asked of anyone, only something that someone might choose to do. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the grassland in shades of gold and amber, Sarah made her decision. She could not simply stand by and watch while an innocent man rode into an ambush. Her feelings for Thomas had grown beyond mere admiration into something deeper, and she could not live with herself if she allowed him to be harmed when she might have prevented it. The question was not whether to act, but how to do so effectively. She needed a plan that would get warning to Thomas without alerting Coulter's men to her intentions. And she needed to execute that plan before the approaching hunters rode close enough to be targeted by the men waiting in ambush. As evening approached and the buffalo herd drew ever closer to Riverside Bend, Sarah Mitchell prepared to risk everything for a man who might not even know her name. The massive Apache brave who hunted buffalo across the Montana plains was about to discover that someone was hunting for his heart with equal determination and considerably more danger. The twilight hours brought an unusual stillness to Riverside Bend, as if the entire settlement was holding its breath. Sarah had retreated to her small cabin behind the schoolhouse, ostensibly to prepare for the next day's lessons, but in reality to finalize the plan that had been forming in her mind throughout the afternoon. The sound of the approaching buffalo herd had grown louder, a constant rumble that seemed to vibrate through the wooden walls and floorboards of her modest dwelling. She had changed from her teaching dress into the practical riding clothes she had brought from Philadelphia but rarely worn since arriving in Montana. The dark blue wool skirt was designed for horseback travel, and the matching jacket provided both warmth and freedom of movement. Her mother would have been horrified to see her preparing for such an adventure, but Sarah had long since abandoned the restrictive expectations of Eastern society. Through her small window, she could see the glow of campfires from Coulter's group, positioned on the northern ridge. The men had made no attempt to conceal their presence, apparently confident that their intimidating reputation would prevent any interference with their plans. They had settled in for what appeared to be a lengthy wait, unaware that their quarry was approaching much sooner than they anticipated. Sarah gathered the supplies she thought she might need for her dangerous mission. A small leather pouch containing water and dried meat, her father's old compass that had guided her across half the continent, and most importantly, the pearl-handled revolver that had been a parting gift from her brother. She had practiced with the weapon during her journey west, understanding that frontier life might require skills her Philadelphia upbringing had never contemplated. The greatest challenge would be reaching the buffalo hunters without being observed by Coulter's sentries. The open grassland provided little cover, especially under the bright moonlight that was beginning to illuminate the landscape, but Sarah had noticed something during her weeks in Riverside Bend that might provide the solution she needed. The Yellowstone River curved around the settlement in a wide arc, its banks lined with cottonwood trees and thick brush that could conceal a person traveling on foot. If she could reach the river without being seen, she might be able to follow its course westward until she encountered the hunters approaching with the buffalo herd. The journey would be difficult and dangerous, but it seemed to offer the best chance of success. Sarah extinguished her lamp and waited for full darkness before slipping out of her cabin. The settlement was quieter than usual, with most families staying close to their homes rather than gathering for the usual evening socializing. Even the trading post, normally a center of activity, showed only dim light from Henderson's private quarters above the store. She made her way carefully between the buildings, using shadows and the natural contours of the land to avoid being silhouetted against the starlit sky. Her heart pounded with a mixture of fear and excitement as she realized she was committed to a course of action that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier. The respectable schoolteacher from Philadelphia was about to become something entirely different. The route to the river required crossing an open space of perhaps 50 yards, but Sarah had timed her movement to coincide with the passage of clouds across the moon. As darkness deepened, she ran across the exposed ground with the speed of desperation, reaching the shelter of the cottonwoods just as moonlight began to return. The riverbank was rougher terrain than she had anticipated, with fallen logs, thick undergrowth, and muddy patches that made silent progress nearly impossible. But the sound of running water helped mask the noise of her passage, and the dense vegetation provided excellent concealment from anyone watching the approaches to the settlement. Sarah had been traveling along the river for perhaps an hour when she first heard the sounds that confirmed her theory. Distant lowing from cattle, the crack of whips, and occasional shouts in languages she didn't recognize. The buffalo hunters were indeed approaching along the river valley, probably planning to water their animals and rest before attempting to sell their harvest in Riverside Bend. She increased her pace, fighting through tangles of brush and scrambling over obstacles in her urgency to make contact before the hunters moved into the killing zone where Coulter's men waited. Her clothing was torn in several places, and her hands were scratched from forcing her way through thorny undergrowth. But she pressed forward with determination fueled by the knowledge that lives depended on her success. The first clear view of the hunting party came as Sarah crested a small rise overlooking a bend in the river. Below her, illuminated by the flickering light of a small campfire, she could see 8 men tending their horses and preparing what appeared to be a simple evening meal. Even from a distance, one figure stood out with unmistakable clarity. Thomas Running Bear sat slightly apart from the others, his massive frame easily recognizable even in the uncertain firelight. He was cleaning a rifle with methodical precision, his movements economical and purposeful. Sarah felt her breath catch as she observed him, realizing that her feelings had intensified during the hours of worry and planning for his safety. But approaching the camp presented new challenges. These were experienced hunters and warriors who would be naturally suspicious of any unexpected visitor, especially one approaching under cover of darkness. Sarah needed to announce her presence in a way that wouldn't provoke a violent response, while still conveying the urgency of her message. She had studied enough frontier customs to know that calling out from a distance was the accepted protocol for approaching the camp of armed men. Moving closer to the edge of the firelight, she took a deep breath and called out in her clearest voice, "Hello, the camp. I'm Sarah Mitchell from Riverside Bend. I need to speak with Thomas Running Bear about a matter of urgent importance." The reaction was immediate and intense. Men rolled away from the fire and into defensive positions, weapons appearing in their hands with startling speed. Sarah found herself looking down the barrels of several rifles, their owners invisible. In the darkness beyond the firelight, "Stay where you are," a voice commanded in accented English. "Step into the light slowly with your hands visible." Sarah complied carefully, moving down the slope with her arms raised to show she carried no weapons. As she entered the circle of firelight, she could see the hunters studying her with expressions ranging from suspicion to outright amazement. A lone woman approaching their camp at night was clearly not something they had expected. Thomas rose slowly from his position, his dark eyes fixed on Sarah's face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. Even in her current circumstances, she couldn't help but notice the way firelight played across his features, emphasizing the strong lines of his jaw and the intelligence in his gaze. "Miss Mitchell," he said, his deep voice carrying a note of surprise. "You are far from the settlement and traveling under dangerous circumstances. What brings you here?" The formal tone of his address reminded Sarah that despite her growing feelings, she and Thomas remained virtual strangers. Her observations of him had been entirely one-sided, and he probably knew little more about her than her name and profession. "There are men waiting in Riverside Bend who mean to harm you," she said directly, understanding that this was not a time for social niceties. "They arrived this morning claiming you stole some kind of Apache artifact. They're armed and organized, and they're positioned to ambush anyone approaching the settlement from this direction." A murmur of voices rose from the other hunters as her words were translated for those who spoke limited English. Sarah caught enough fragments to understand they were discussing the implications of her warning and debating their response to this unexpected development. Thomas stepped closer to her, close enough that she could see the concern in his expression. "These men, how many and what kind of weapons?" "Perhaps 15 total, with rifles and pistols. Their leader is named Jake Coulter, and he claims to have sworn statements identifying you as a thief. But Mr. Henderson believes they're lying about their legal authority." Thomas nodded slowly, his jaw tightening with what might have been anger or determination. "Coulter, I know this name. He works for men who profit from conflicts between whites and Indians. They create incidents that justify military action against my people." Sarah felt her stomach clench as she realized the implications of his words. "You mean they're trying to provoke a war?" "Not a war exactly, but enough violence to justify seizing Apache lands that contain valuable minerals. Coulter has been involved in similar schemes throughout the territory." Thomas looked back toward his companions, then returned his attention to Sarah. "Your warning may have saved not just my life, but the lives of many innocent people." The gravity of the situation settled over Sarah like a heavy blanket. She had thought she was simply helping one man avoid an unjust accusation, but the reality was far more complex. Her actions tonight might help prevent a larger tragedy that could affect entire communities. "What will you do now?" she asked. Thomas was quiet for a moment, clearly considering their limited options. "We cannot simply avoid Riverside Bend indefinitely. These buffalo must be processed and sold, and my people need the income from this. Hunt, but approaching the settlement would be walking into certain death." One of the other hunters, a weathered man with graying hair, spoke up in rapid Apache. Thomas listened carefully before responding in the same language. The conversation continued for several minutes, with occasional gestures towards Sarah and the direction of the settlement. Red Hawk suggests that we circle north and approach Billings instead, Thomas explained to Sarah. The prices will be lower, but we would avoid the immediate danger. That would mean abandoning the people of Riverside Bend to deal with Coulter and his men alone, Sarah pointed out. And what happens when they realize you're not coming? They might take their frustration out on innocent settlers. Thomas studied her face in the firelight, and Sarah had the uncomfortable feeling he was seeing more than she intended to reveal. You are very concerned about the welfare of people you have known for only a few weeks. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she met his gaze steadily. I believe in standing up for what's right, regardless of how long I've known the people involved. And you risk considerable danger to bring this warning to someone you barely know. The observation hung in the air between them, carrying implications that Sarah wasn't prepared to explore. She had indeed risked everything to warn Thomas, and her motivations went beyond abstract principles of justice. But admitting her personal feelings would be presumptuous and inappropriate given their limited acquaintance. Any decent person would have done the same thing, she replied, though her voice lacked conviction. Thomas continued to study her for a moment longer before turning back to his companions. Another discussion followed, this one more animated than the first. Sarah could sense disagreement among the hunters about their best course of action, with some apparently favoring the safer option of avoiding Riverside Bend entirely. Finally, Thomas returned his attention to Sarah. We have decided to scout the situation before making a final decision. But you cannot return to the settlement tonight. Coulter's men will be watching for any sign that someone has warned us, and your presence back in town so soon after leaving would be suspicious. Sarah hadn't considered this complication, but she immediately saw the logic in his reasoning. Her secret departure had probably gone unnoticed, but a nighttime return might attract exactly the kind of attention that could prove deadly for everyone involved. Where can I go? She asked, suddenly aware of how completely she had committed herself to this dangerous course of action. You will stay with us tonight, Thomas replied. It is not ideal, but it is safer than any alternative. The prospect of spending the night in a hunting camp, surrounded by armed men, would have terrified Sarah just weeks earlier. But her time on the frontier had taught her to judge people by their actions rather than their appearances, and everything she had observed suggested that Thomas and his companions were honorable men. Red Hawk approached them carrying a blanket and what appeared to be dried meat and water. He spoke to Thomas in Apache, his tone respectful but concerned. Sarah caught enough words to understand he was questioning the wisdom of involving a white woman in their dangerous situation. Red Hawk worries that helping you will be seen as taking sides in a white man's conflict, Thomas explained. He has seen how such involvement usually ends for my people. Sarah understood the concern. Native Americans who became involved in disputes between white settlers often found themselves blamed regardless of their intentions or actions. By accepting her warning and offering her protection, Thomas and his companions were taking risks that extended far beyond the immediate danger from Coulter's group. I don't want to bring trouble to your people, she said sincerely. Perhaps I should try to make it back to town after all. No, Thomas replied firmly. What is done is done. We will face whatever consequences arise together. The simple statement carried weight that took Sarah's breath away. In the span of a few hours, she had gone from being a lonely schoolteacher, observing a mysterious man from a distance, to being partners in a situation that could determine both their fates. Red Hawk handed her the blanket and provisions with a slight nod that she interpreted as acceptance, if not enthusiasm. The other hunters had returned to their evening activities, apparently concluding that her presence was now an established fact that required no further discussion. Thomas gestured toward a fallen log near the edge of the firelight. You should rest while you can. Tomorrow will bring challenges that will require all our strength and wisdom." Sarah settled onto the makeshift seat, wrapping the blanket around, her shoulders against the mountain chill. The events of the day seemed almost impossible to believe. This morning she had been a respectable schoolteacher, worried about delayed supply wagons. Tonight she was a fugitive planning to help a man she barely knew avoid an ambush by dangerous criminals. But as she watched Thomas moving around the camp, checking weapons and speaking quietly with his companions, Sarah realized she had never felt more alive or more purposeful. The constraints of her previous life seemed distant and unimportant, compared to the immediate reality of survival and the possibility of making a real difference in the lives of people she had come to care about. The buffalo herd had settled for the night somewhere to the west, their presence marked by the occasional lowing of cattle and the persistent earthy smell that accompanied such massive gatherings of animals. The hunters would need to begin processing their harvest at dawn, but the proximity of Coulter's group complicated every aspect of their normal routine. Thomas returned to the fire and sat across from Sarah, his rifle resting across his knees. In the flickering light, she could see the concern etched in his features as he contemplated their limited options. "Tell me about these accusations Coulter is making," she said quietly. "Are they based on any real incident?" Thomas was silent for so long that Sarah began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain and frustration. "Last spring, I was guiding a supply train through Powder River country when we encountered what appeared to be an archaeological expedition. The leader claimed to be a professor from an eastern university, studying ancient Native American sites." Sarah listened intently, understanding that she was hearing information that could be crucial to their survival. "But their methods were wrong," Thomas continued. "They were destroying sites rather than studying them, taking artifacts without regard for their sacred significance. When I protested, they became hostile and accused me of interfering with legitimate scientific research. What happened then? The expedition leader tried to have me arrested by a military patrol that was traveling with them. When that failed, they attempted to force me away from the area by threatening violence against any Native Americans they encountered." Sarah felt her anger rising as she understood the injustice of the situation. "So you defended yourself and your people, and now they're claiming you're a thief." "Worse than that," Thomas replied grimly. "The expedition leader was killed during the confrontation that followed. Not by me, but by one of his own men during an argument about dividing the artifacts they had stolen. But survivors are claiming I murdered him." The implications of his words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Coulter and his men weren't just pursuing a theft charge, but a murder accusation that could result in immediate execution without trial if they succeeded in capturing Thomas. "Why haven't you taken this information to the territorial authorities?" she asked. Thomas's expression held the kind of weary resignation that spoke of experiences she could barely imagine. "Because I am Apache, and white courts do not often listen to Apache testimony about white crimes. The word of expedition survivors would be accepted without question, while my account would be dismissed as self-serving lies." Sarah understood with crystal clarity why Thomas had chosen to avoid legal authorities rather than trust in their fairness. The frontier justice system was designed by and for white settlers, with little consideration for the rights or perspectives of Native Americans. But surely there must be someone who would listen to the truth. "Perhaps," Thomas replied. "But finding such a person would require surviving long enough to present the evidence. Coulter and his employers prefer to avoid legal complications by eliminating witnesses rather than risking a trial." The stark realities of their situation settled over Sarah like a cold wind. They were facing men who had already demonstrated their willingness to kill in pursuit of their goals, and the legal system offered no protection for anyone who didn't fit the established power structure. Red Hawk approached the fire and spoke quietly to Thomas and Apache. Sarah caught enough words to understand he was reporting on scouting observations from the direction of Riverside Bend. Thomas's expression grew even more serious as he listened to the report. "Coulter's men have moved closer to the settlement," he explained to Sarah. "They're positioned to control all the approaches from the west. Anyone trying to reach town will have to pass directly through their field of fire." Sarah felt her stomach tighten with fear for the innocent families sleeping peacefully in Riverside Bend, unaware of the danger surrounding their community. What about the people in town? Are they safe? For now, probably. Coulter needs to maintain the pretense that he represents legitimate authority until he accomplishes his real objectives. But if his plans are frustrated, he might become less concerned about maintaining appearances. The weight of responsibility pressed down on Sarah as she realized how many lives hung in the balance of their decisions. Her impulsive action in warning Thomas had set in motion a chain of events that could affect the entire region. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I thought I was just helping one person avoid an unjust accusation. I didn't realize I was involving so many others in danger." Thomas looked at her across the dying fire, his dark eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "You acted from courage and conscience. The danger was already present, created by men who profit from violence and injustice. Your warning simply revealed what was hidden." His words offered some comfort, but Sarah still felt the burden of unintended consequences. Every choice seemed to lead to greater complications and risks for people she had grown to care about. "What happens now?" she asked. Thomas stood and moved to check on the horses, his movements fluid despite his imposing size. "Now we try to find a solution that protects innocent people while preventing Coulter from achieving his larger goals. And if no such solution exists?" Thomas paused in his activities and looked back at her, his expression grave but determined. "Then we face whatever comes with honor and hope that justice will eventually prevail." The simple statement embodied a philosophy that Sarah was beginning to understand defined not just Thomas as an individual, but the code by which many frontier people lived. When legal protection was uncertain and authority was distant, personal integrity became the foundation of civilization. As the night deepened and the camp settled into watchful silence, Sarah found herself contemplating a future that bore no resemblance to anything she had previously imagined. Whatever tomorrow brought, she would face it alongside a man whose courage and principles had earned her respect and something deeper that she was only beginning to acknowledge. The massive Apache brave who hunted buffalo across the Montana plains was about to discover that someone had been hunting for his heart with equal determination and considerably more success than either of them had yet realized. Dawn broke across the Montana plains with the kind of crystalline clarity that made the vast landscape appear infinite in every direction. Sarah woke to the sound of quiet activity as the hunters prepared for what they all understood would be a day of crucial decisions. The buffalo herd had moved closer during the night, and the earthy scent of thousands of animals carried on the morning breeze. She had slept fitfully, her dreams filled with images of armed men and desperate flights across open terrain. But, awakening in the hunting camp, surrounded by the purposeful movements of experienced frontiersmen, she felt a strange sense of belonging that surprised her. These men had accepted her presence without question once Thomas had vouched for her, treating her with a respectful courtesy that made her feel valued rather than burdensome. Thomas was already awake, standing at the edge of the camp studying the eastern horizon through a small telescope. His massive frame was silhouetted against the lightning sky, and Sarah found herself watching the way dawnlight played across his features. There was something about his quiet competence that drew her attention regardless of the circumstances they faced. Red Hawk approached her with a cup of coffee and what appeared to be cornbread sweetened with wild honey. The older hunter's manner toward her had warmed considerably overnight, and she sensed that her willingness to risk danger for Thomas's sake had earned his respect. "Good morning," she said, accepting the simple breakfast gratefully. "Has there been any change in the situation?" Red Hawk gestured toward Thomas, indicating that she should direct her questions to the younger man. Sarah understood that despite his apparent youth compared to some of the other hunters, Thomas held a position of leadership that went beyond mere size or hunting skill. She approached him carefully, not wanting to interrupt his surveillance of their surroundings. Up close, she could see the tension in his posture and the concentration etched in his expression. Whatever he was observing through the telescope clearly concerned him. "More riders approaching from the north," Thomas said without looking away from the eyepiece. "At least 6 additional men, well armed and moving with military precision." Sarah felt her stomach drop as she realized the implications. Reinforcements for Coulter? Almost certainly. Which means our situation has become significantly more dangerous. Thomas lowered the telescope and turned to face her, his dark eyes serious. "They are establishing a perimeter that will make any approach to Riverside Bend virtually impossible." The weight of their predicament settled over Sarah like a heavy cloak. Not only were they trapped in an increasingly dangerous position, but the people of Riverside Bend remained unaware of the threat surrounding their community. Innocent families were going about their morning routines, while armed men positioned themselves for what could become a massacre. "There has to be something we can do," Sarah said, though her voice lacked conviction. "We can't just wait here while those people walk into danger." Thomas studied her face for a moment, and she had the uncomfortable feeling he was measuring her resolve for challenges even greater than those they had already faced. "There is one possibility, but it would require courage beyond anything you have already demonstrated. Tell me." Thomas gestured for her to follow him away from the main camp, where they could speak privately without being overheard by the other hunters. They walked to a small rise that provided a view of the surrounding terrain, the morning light revealing the full scope of their tactical situation. "Coulter's plan depends on surprise and overwhelming force," Thomas explained. "He has positioned his men to control the obvious approaches to the settlement, but he assumes his targets will be naive about frontier warfare." Sarah listened intently, trying to follow his reasoning while simultaneously being distracted by his proximity. Standing close enough to see the details of his face, she noticed things she had missed during their previous conversations. The thin scar along his left cheek that spoke of past violence survived. The careful way he moved despite his size, as if always conscious of potential threats. The intelligence in his dark eyes that suggested depths she was only beginning to glimpse. What if we could turn his assumptions against him? Thomas continued. Create a situation where his superior numbers become a disadvantage rather than an asset. How would we do that? Thomas pointed toward the distant settlement, barely visible through the morning haze. Riverside Bend sits in a natural bowl surrounded by low hills. Coulter has positioned his men on those hills to control the approaches, but that same positioning isolates them from each other and from immediate support. Sarah began to see the outline of his strategy. You're thinking of attacking them separately, rather than facing their combined strength. Not attacking exactly, but certainly disrupting their plans in ways they won't anticipate. Thomas's expression grew more serious. But such a strategy would require someone to enter the settlement and coordinate with the townspeople. Someone Coulter's men wouldn't immediately recognize as a threat. The implications of his words hit Sarah with stunning clarity. He was suggesting that she return to Riverside Bend and somehow organize the settlers for resistance against a superior force of professional killers. The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. You want me to go back to town and convince the people to fight. I want you to go back and help them understand the true nature of the threat they face. Coulter is counting on the settlers remaining passive while he conducts his business. If they realize they are also in danger, they might be willing to take action to protect themselves. Sarah considered the proposal, her mind racing through the practical difficulties and moral implications. She had never been involved in anything approaching organized violence, but the alternative seemed to be standing by while innocent people were destroyed by men who viewed human life as expendable. What makes you think the townspeople would listen to me? I'm just a schoolteacher who's been in their community for a few weeks. Thomas smiled slightly, the expression transforming his usually serious features. You are a woman who risked everything to warn strangers about danger. That kind of courage tends to be recognized and respected by people who face hardship every day. The compliment warmed Sarah more than she expected, but she forced herself to focus on the practical aspects of his proposal. Even if they agreed to help, most of the settlers aren't experienced fighters. How could they hope to stand against professional gunmen? They don't need to defeat Coulter's men in direct combat, Thomas explained. They just need to create enough confusion and resistance to disrupt his plans and buy time for other solutions to develop. What other solutions? Thomas was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested he was sharing information of crucial importance. I sent word to my cousin yesterday, before you arrived. Black Eagle leads a band of warriors who have been tracking Coulter's group for weeks, gathering evidence of their criminal activities. If we can delay Coulter's attack until tonight, Black Eagle's men will be in position to intervene. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension at this news. The prospect of trained Apache warriors evening the odds was encouraging, but it also meant that the conflict was escalating beyond anything she had originally envisioned. How many warriors are we talking about? Perhaps 20, all experienced in warfare and highly motivated to see justice done. Coulter and his employers have been responsible for attacks on several Apache settlements over the past year. My people have strong reasons for wanting him brought to account. The revelation added new dimensions to Sarah's understanding of the situation. What had seemed like a personal vendetta against Thomas was actually part of a much larger pattern of violence and exploitation affecting entire communities throughout the territory. So this isn't really about you at all, she said, beginning to grasp the true scope of Coulter's operations. It is about all of us, Thomas corrected. White settlers, Apache, Mexican families, anyone who stands in the way of men who profit from conflict and chaos. Coulter works for interests that see this entire region as territory to be exploited rather than home to people with legitimate rights. Sarah felt anger rising in her chest as she contemplated the cynical calculations that had brought violence to what should have been a peaceful community. Men like Coulter viewed human beings as obstacles to be removed, rather than individuals with inherent worth and dignity. What would you need me to do if I agree to return to town? Thomas outlined a plan that was both simple and terrifyingly dangerous. Sarah would return to Riverside Bend openly, claiming to have been visiting friends at a distant ranch. Her absence overnight could be explained as an innocent social call that had lasted longer than expected. Once back in the settlement, she would need to carefully approach trusted individuals like Henderson and share enough information to convince them of the immediate danger. The goal would be to organize a coordinated response that could begin at a predetermined signal. The key is timing, Thomas emphasized. Any action must be simultaneous across all of Coulter's positions. If even one group of his men remains operational, they could inflict terrible casualties on the townspeople. Sarah understood the brutal mathematics of their situation. Success would require perfect coordination and considerable luck. Failure would likely result in a massacre that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. When would this need to happen? Tonight, after the moon sets. Black Eagle's warriors will be in position by then, and darkness will help neutralize some of Coulter's advantages. The timeline gave Sarah most of the day to return to town and organize whatever resistance could be mustered, but it also meant committing to a course of action with very little time for second thoughts or detailed planning. What about you and the other hunters? What will you be doing while I'm trying to convince the townspeople to fight for their lives?" Thomas's expression grew serious. "We will be creating diversions to draw Coulter's attention away from the settlement, making him think his primary targets are elsewhere while you prepare the real response." Sarah realized that Thomas and his companions would be placing themselves in extreme danger to provide cover for her mission. They would be deliberately attracting the attention of superior forces while she worked to organize resistance from relative safety. "That's incredibly dangerous for you." "Everything about this situation is dangerous," Thomas replied simply. "The question is whether we choose to act with purpose or simply wait for others to determine our fate." Sarah found herself studying Thomas's face as he spoke, noting the quiet determination that seemed to define his approach to every challenge. There was no bravado or false heroism in his manner, just a steady resolve to do what he believed was right regardless of the personal cost. "Thomas," she said quietly, surprised by her own boldness, "before I answer, I need to ask you something personal." He looked at her with curiosity, clearly not expecting such a request in their current circumstances. "What would you like to know?" Sarah felt heat rising in her cheeks, but she pressed forward with the question that had been forming in her mind since their first real conversation. "Why did you trust me enough to share all of this information? You barely know me, and what I am asking could put your people at terrible risk." Thomas was quiet for so long that Sarah began to think she had overstepped some boundary of propriety. When he finally answered, his voice carried a note of vulnerability she had not heard before. "Because when you appeared in our camp last night, risking everything to warn someone you had never spoken to, you showed me something I had not seen in many years. What was that? A person who acts from the heart rather than from calculation. Someone who believes that doing the right thing matters more than personal safety or social expectations." Sarah felt her breath catch at the intensity in his voice, and the way his dark eyes seemed to see directly into her soul. The moment stretched between them, charged with implications that went far beyond their immediate crisis. "I hunt buffalo because it provides for my people and allows me to remain close to the land of my ancestors," Thomas continued, his voice growing quieter. "But if I am honest, I have been hunting for something else as well. Something I had begun to think might not exist in this world of violence and greed." Sarah's heart began to race as she understood what he was trying to tell her. The confession she had imagined hearing someday was actually happening, but in circumstances she could never have anticipated. "What have you been hunting for?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Thomas stepped closer, close enough that she could see the sincerity in his expression and the careful hope in his dark eyes. "I have been hunting for a heart that could understand mine. For someone who could see beyond the differences that divide our peoples and recognize the person beneath." The simple declaration carried more emotional weight than any elaborate romantic speech Sarah had ever read in books or imagined in her private dreams. This massive Apache brave who had seemed so remote and untouchable was revealing feelings that matched her own with stunning directness. "Thomas," she whispered, hardly trusting her voice to remain steady, "I feel the same way. I have been watching you for weeks, admiring your strength and wisdom, but I never dared hope you might notice someone like me." Thomas reached out and gently touched her hand, his fingers warm and surprisingly gentle for someone so obviously accustomed to violence and hardship. "Someone like you? You mean someone brave enough to risk everything for strangers? Someone intelligent enough to see injustice and principled enough to act against it?" Sarah felt tears threatening as the emotional walls she had built around her feelings finally crumbled completely. Here in the middle of a crisis that could cost them both their lives, she was experiencing the kind of connection she had dreamed of but never really believed possible. "I hunt buffalo," Thomas said, his voice carrying a note of wonder, "but I find myself hunting your heart with equal determination and considerably more hope for success." Before Sarah could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats reminded them both that their personal moment was taking place in the middle of extremely dangerous circumstances. They stepped apart reluctantly as Red Hawk approached with news that could not wait for more convenient timing. The older hunter spoke rapidly in Apache, his tone urgent and concerned. Sarah watched Thomas's expression grow increasingly serious. As he listened to the report, "What is it?" she asked when the conversation ended. "Coulter's reinforcements have completed their positioning around the settlement. Red Hawk counts at least 20 men now, all armed with military weapons and organized into coordinated groups." Sarah felt the weight of their situation pressing down on her with renewed force. The odds they faced had become even more daunting. But paradoxically, her resolve had strengthened rather than weakened. Thomas's confession had given her something precious to fight for beyond abstract principles of justice. "Then we need to act quickly before they become even stronger," she sighed, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. Thomas studied her face, and she saw admiration mixed with concern in his expression. "You are certain you want to attempt this? Once you enter the settlement, there will be no retreat if the plan fails." Sarah thought about the life she had left behind in Philadelphia, with its predictable routines and safe social conventions. Then she looked at Thomas, this remarkable man who had just offered her his heart, along with a chance to make a real difference in the world. "I'm certain," she said firmly, "but I want you to promise me something in return." "What would you ask of me?" "Promise me that you'll survive this, that you'll be careful and come back to me when it's over." Thomas smiled, the expression lighting up his features with warmth that took her breath away. "I promise to do everything in my power to return to you safely. But you must make the same promise to me." Sarah nodded, understanding that they were making a commitment that went far beyond the immediate crisis. They were pledging themselves to a future together, assuming they could survive the next 24 hours. "I promise," she said simply. Thomas leaned down and kissed her forehead gently, a gesture of affection that somehow felt more intimate than any elaborate romantic display. "Then let us begin the most important hunt of our lives." As they returned to the camp to finalize their desperate plan, Sarah realized that everything in her life had led to this moment. The respectable schoolteacher from Philadelphia was about to become something entirely different, motivated by love and justice in equal measure. The massive Apache brave who hunted buffalo across the Montana plains had indeed captured her heart, and now she was prepared to risk everything to ensure they both survived to explore what they had found together. The most dangerous part of their story was just beginning, but Sarah felt more alive and purposeful than ever before in her life. The midday sun cast harsh shadows across the grassland as Sarah made her solitary approach toward Riverside Bend. She rode one of the hunters' horses, a steady mare that had been chosen for reliability rather than speed. The animal's calm demeanor helped mask the nervous energy that threatened to overwhelm her as she drew closer to what might be the most dangerous performance of her life. Thomas and his companions had departed an hour earlier, riding north to Comus, begin the diversionary tactics that would hopefully draw Coulter's attention away from the settlement. Sarah had watched them disappear into the rolling hills with a mixture of pride and terror, knowing that the man she loved was deliberately placing himself in mortal danger to give her mission a chance of success. The plan they had developed was necessarily simple, but its execution would require perfect timing and considerable courage from people who had never expected to find themselves in such circumstances. Sarah's role was to return to town as naturally as possible, then carefully approach trusted individuals with enough information to organize effective resistance. As she crested the final ridge overlooking Riverside Bend, Sarah could see the settlement spread out below her like a peaceful painting of frontier life. Smoke rose from chimneys, children played in the dusty streets, and the normal rhythms of daily activity continued as if deadly threats were not positioned on every surrounding hilltop. But Sarah's trained eye could now spot the signs of danger. that would have been invisible to her just days earlier. Dark figures positioned among the rocks and trees on the ridges. The glint of sunlight reflecting off rifle barrels. The subtle wrongness of men watching and waiting where only wildlife should be present. The first test of her acting ability came at the settlement's edge, where one of Coulter's sentries had positioned himself to observe anyone approaching from the west. Sarah forced herself to ride with the casual confidence of someone returning from a pleasant social visit, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. The sentry stepped out from behind a large boulder as she approached, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. He was a thin man with cold eyes, and the kind of calculating expression that suggested violence was never far from his thoughts. "Morning, miss," he called out, his tone carrying false friendliness. "You're traveling alone through some dangerous country." Sarah reined in her horse and smiled with what she hoped appeared to be innocent gratitude. "Good morning. Yes, I suppose it was foolish of me to visit the Morrison ranch by myself, but their daughter has been ill and they needed help with the younger children." The explanation had been carefully crafted to sound believable while being difficult to verify quickly. The Morrison ranch was real, but distant enough that checking her story would require significant time and effort. "Morrison Ranch," the sentry repeated, studying her face for signs of deception. "That's quite a ride for a lady traveling alone." "Mrs. Morrison is a dear friend from back east," Sarah replied, maintaining her cheerful demeanor despite the man's obvious suspicion. When you care about someone, distance doesn't seem so important. The sentiment was genuine, though Sarah was thinking about Thomas rather than any fictional friendship when she spoke the words. The sincerity in her voice seemed to convince the sentry, who stepped back and waved her forward. "Well, you be careful riding around by yourself. There are dangerous characters in these parts, and a respectable lady like yourself shouldn't take unnecessary risks." Sarah thanked him politely and continued toward the settlement, fighting the urge to look back and see if he was watching her progress. Every instinct screamed at her to flee this place where death waited around every corner, but she forced herself to maintain the facade of normalcy that might be the only thing keeping innocent people alive. The trading post was busy with its usual midday activity when Sarah arrived. Henderson looked up from serving the customer and nodded in acknowledgement of her return, his expression carefully neutral. Sarah understood that even a trusted ally might not be aware of who could be watching and listening. She dismounted and tied her horse to the hitching post with deliberate casualness, taking time to pat the animal's neck and adjust her riding skirt as any lady might do after a long journey. But her eyes were scanning the crowd for faces she recognized and trusted, mentally cataloging who was present and who might be missing. "Miss Mitchell," Henderson called out as she approached the trading post entrance. "How was your visit with the Morrison family?" Sarah understood that he was providing her with an opportunity to establish her cover story publicly. "Very pleasant, thank you. Their youngest daughter is recovering nicely from her fever, though Mrs. Morrison was quite worn out from nursing her." The simple exchange served multiple purposes, establishing Sarah's alibi while also signaling to Henderson that she needed to speak with him privately. Years of frontier life had taught people to communicate in subtle ways when circumstances required discretion. She spent several minutes browsing through the store's merchandise, examining bolts of cloth and kitchen implements while actually studying the faces around her. Most were familiar settlers she had come to know during her weeks in Riverside Bend, but she noticed several strangers whose presence immediately raised her suspicions. 2 men lingered near the ammunition display, their clothes marking them as drifters rather than local ranchers or farmers. They spoke in quiet voices while pretending to examine boxes of cartridges, but Sarah caught enough fragments of their conversation to understand they were discussing fields of fire and escape routes rather than hunting supplies. A third stranger sat at a table near the window, nursing a cup of coffee that had clearly grown cold hours earlier. His position provided an excellent view of the street and the approaches to the trading post, and his eyes constantly moved between the windows and the faces of everyone who entered or left the store. Sarah realized with growing alarm that Coulter had not only positioned men outside the settlement, but had also infiltrated the community itself. The scope of his operation was far more sophisticated than she had imagined, and the danger to innocent civilians was correspondingly greater. Henderson appeared beside her as she studied a display of canned goods, his voice barely above a whisper. "Miss Mitchell, I think you should know that we've had some unusual visitors today. Men asking questions about people and making observations that seem mighty specific for casual travelers." Sarah nodded slightly, understanding that Henderson had reached conclusions similar to her own. "How many strangers would you estimate are currently in town?" "At least 6 that I've identified, probably more that I haven't spotted yet. They're trying to blend in, but they don't know our community well enough to avoid standing out to someone who's been here as long as I have." The information confirmed Sarah's worst fears about the complexity of their situation. Coulter's men were not simply surrounding Riverside Bend, but had actually penetrated the settlement itself. Any organized resistance would have to account for enemies who were already inside their defenses. "Mr. Henderson," Sarah said quietly, making her decision to trust him with information that could prove fatal if mishandled. "I need to speak with you privately about a matter of urgent importance to everyone in this community." Henderson's expression grew serious as he recognized the gravity in her tone. "My office is in the back. We can talk there without being overheard." They made their way through the store with careful casualness, Henderson stopping to assist customers and Sarah continuing to browse merchandise as if she had no particular urgency. But both were acutely aware of the strangers whose attention seemed to follow their movements. Henderson's office was a cramped space behind the main store, filled with ledger books and inventory records. More importantly, it had only one entrance and thick walls that would prevent their conversation from being overheard by eavesdroppers. "Miss Mitchell," Henderson said once the door was closed, "I've been in this business long enough to recognize trouble when I see it. Whatever you need to tell me, I'm prepared to listen." Sarah took a deep breath and committed herself to a revelation that would change everything for both of them. "The strangers you've noticed are working for a man named Jake Coulter. They're here to capture or kill Thomas Running Bear, but their real goal is to provoke a conflict that will justify military action against Apache settlements." Henderson's face grew pale as he absorbed the implications of her words. "How do you know this?" "Because I warned Thomas about the danger and learned the full scope of what we're facing. Coulter's men are positioned on every ridge surrounding the settlement, and they've infiltrated the town itself. They're prepared to use violence against anyone who interferes with their plans." The trading post owner was quiet for a moment, clearly struggling to process information that transformed his understanding of their situation. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man confronting his worst fears. "How many men are we talking about?" "At least 20, possibly more. All well-armed and organized with military precision." Sarah paused, then added the information. "That would make their circumstances even more terrifying. And they've already demonstrated their willingness to kill innocent people to achieve their objectives." Henderson sank into his chair, the full horror of their predicament settling over him like a suffocating blanket. "What can we possibly do against such odds? Most of the men in this settlement are farmers and shopkeepers, not gunfighters. We don't need to defeat them in direct combat," Sarah explained, repeating the strategy Thomas had outlined. "We need to create enough confusion and resistance to disrupt their plans until help can arrive." "What kind of help?" Sarah hesitated, knowing that her next revelation would add even more complexity to an already dangerous situation. "Thomas has contacted Apache warriors who have been tracking Coulter's group. They're willing to intervene, but only if we can delay Coulter's attack until tonight." Henderson's expression shifted as he contemplated the prospect of Apache warriors fighting alongside white settlers against a common enemy. Such cooperation was almost unprecedented in the territory, but the circumstances they faced were equally extraordinary. You're asking me to help organize armed resistance against professional killers, trusting in the assistance of Apache warriors, based on the word of a man most people in this settlement barely know. Sarah understood his hesitation, but she also recognized that Henderson was a practical man who would evaluate their options based on cold reality rather than prejudice or fear. I'm asking you to help save the lives of everyone in this community, including the children in my classroom who trust us to protect them. The mention of the children seemed to crystallize Henderson's resolve. He had watched Sarah work with the young people of Riverside Bend, witnessing her dedication and genuine care for their welfare. If she believed the danger was real and immediate, he was prepared to trust her judgment. "What would you need from me?" Sarah outlined the plan Thomas had developed, emphasizing the need for simultaneous action across multiple locations. Henderson's role would be to quietly contact trusted men in the community and coordinate their response to a predetermined signal. "The key is secrecy until the moment we act," Sarah emphasized. "If Coulter's men discover our preparations, they'll attack immediately rather than risk losing the advantage of surprise." Henderson nodded, his merchant's mind already calculating logistics and probabilities. "How many people do you think we can count on?" "Anyone who has family to protect and the courage to fight for them. This isn't about politics or territorial disputes anymore. It's about survival." They spent the next hour identifying potential allies and developing communication methods that wouldn't attract attention from the strangers watching the settlement. Henderson's knowledge of the community proved invaluable as he suggested approaches for different individuals based on their personalities and relationships. The plan that emerged was necessarily improvised and dependent on factors beyond their control, but it represented their best hope for surviving the night. Each trusted man would be responsible for recruiting additional help while maintaining absolute secrecy about their preparations. "When do we begin?" Henderson asked as they finalized their strategy. "Immediately, but carefully. We have perhaps 6 hours before the signal, and every minute of preparation could mean the difference between success and disaster." Henderson stood and moved toward the door, then paused to look back at Sarah with an expression of profound respect. "Miss Mitchell, I want you to know that what you're doing takes more courage than most people possess. Whatever happens tonight, you should be proud of the choice you've made." Sarah felt warmth spread through her chest at his words, but she also recognized the weight of responsibility that came with his praise. People were going to follow her lead into danger, trusting her judgment about threats they couldn't fully comprehend. "Mr. Henderson, I'm terrified that I'm making a mistake that will cost people their lives." "Fear is appropriate given our circumstances," Henderson replied. "But refusing to act would guarantee the outcome you're trying to prevent. Sometimes courage means proceeding despite uncertainty, rather than waiting for perfect information." His words echoed themes Sarah had heard from Thomas, and she realized that frontier life had taught both men similar lessons about the necessity of decisive action in the face of incomplete knowledge and overwhelming odds. They left the office separately, Henderson returning to serve customers while Sarah browsed the store for items that might prove useful in the coming confrontation. She selected supplies with careful consideration, choosing items that could serve double purposes without attracting attention from watching enemies. The afternoon passed with agonizing slowness as Sarah waited for opportunities to make contact with potential allies. Each conversation required delicate balance between conveying urgency and maintaining secrecy, and she found herself constantly aware of the strangers whose presence represented immediate danger to anyone who appeared suspicious. Her first successful recruitment was Martha Brennan, the wife of a local rancher who had demonstrated both intelligence and courage during previous community crises. Sarah approached her at the general store, using a discussion about fabric choices to mask a whispered explanation of their desperate circumstances. Martha's reaction was immediate and practical. How many women and children will need protection during whatever happens tonight? Sarah hadn't fully considered the logistics of protecting non-combatants, but Martha's question highlighted a crucial aspect of their planning that required immediate attention. The women and children of Riverside Bend would need secure shelter during the fighting, and organizing their safety would require additional coordination. We'll need to gather them in the most defensible building available, Sarah realized. Somewhere with thick walls and limited entrances. The church, Martha suggested immediately. Stone construction, few windows, and large enough to accommodate everyone who needs shelter. The solution was obvious once Martha mentioned it, and Sarah felt grateful for the older woman's practical wisdom. But implementing the plan would require convincing families to abandon their homes based on warnings about dangers they couldn't see or fully understand. How do we get people to cooperate without creating panic? Sarah asked. Martha smiled grimly. Leave that to the women of this community. We've been preparing for various disasters since the day we arrived on this frontier. Most of us will welcome clear instructions about how to protect our families. The confidence in Martha's voice reminded Sarah that frontier women possessed their own forms of courage and competence that were often overlooked by outside observers. These were people who had chosen to build lives in dangerous territory, and they understood the realities of survival better than sheltered civilians from eastern cities. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of gunfire from the northern hills, distant but unmistakable. Several rapid shots echoed across the grassland, followed by longer intervals of silence that somehow seemed more ominous than the initial violence. Every person in the trading post stopped their activities and turned toward the windows, straining to hear additional sounds that might explain the shooting. Sarah felt her heart racing as she realized that Thomas and his companions had begun their diversionary attacks earlier than planned. One of the strangers near the ammunition display suddenly became much more alert, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon as he exchanged glances with his companion. Sarah realized that these men were probably in communication with Coulter's forces and would soon learn the details of whatever confrontation was occurring in the hills. It's starting, Martha whispered, understanding immediately that the gunfire represented the beginning of their desperate gambit. Sarah nodded, her mouth suddenly dry with fear and anticipation. The careful planning and gradual preparation were ending, replaced by the brutal immediacy of violent conflict. Within hours, everyone she had come to care about would be fighting for their lives against overwhelming odds. But as she looked around the trading post at the faces of people she had learned to respect and admire, Sarah felt a surge of determination that surprised her with its intensity. These were good people who deserved protection from men who viewed human life as expendable. Whatever happened in the coming hours, she would not allow Coulter and his employers to destroy this community without a fight. The massive Apache brave who had captured her heart was now risking everything to give her mission a chance of success. Sarah would not disappoint him or the innocent people who were counting on her courage and judgment. The most dangerous part of their story was finally beginning, and she was as ready as anyone could be for what was coming. Darkness fell across the Montana plains like a protective cloak, bringing with it the moment Sarah had both dreaded and anticipated throughout the long afternoon. The settlement of Riverside Bend had transformed from a peaceful frontier community into an armed camp, though the casual observer would never have guessed the deadly preparations hidden beneath the surface of normal evening activities. The church bell tower served as Sarah's command post, providing an elevated view of the surrounding hills where Coulter's men waited in ambush positions. Through the small telescope Henderson had provided, she could see the orange glow of their campfires and occasionally catch glimpses of movement among the rocks and trees. The enemy force appeared confident and relaxed, apparently convinced that their targets would arrive as expected. But Sarah knew that Thomas and his fellow hunters were already in position, having spent the afternoon leading Coulter's scouts on a carefully orchestrated chase through the northern canyons. The diversionary tactics had drawn at least half of the enemy force away from the settlement, evening odds that had seemed impossible just hours earlier. Martha Brennan climbed the narrow stairs to join Sarah in the bell tower, her weathered face grim with determination. "The women and children are all secured in the church basement," she reported quietly. 42 souls total, with enough supplies to last several days if necessary. Sarah nodded her appreciation, knowing that Martha had accomplished a minor miracle in convincing so many families to abandon their homes based on warnings about invisible dangers. The fact that people had trusted her judgment spoke to the respect she had earned during her weeks in the community. "What about the men? Are they ready for the signal?" "Henderson has positioned them according to your plan. 12 fighters. Cover in the 4 main approaches to town, with additional defenders watching the trading post and other key buildings." Martha paused, then added with characteristic honesty, "Most of them are scared, but they understand what's at stake." Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling over her like a physical burden. In a few minutes, she would give the signal that would launch ordinary farmers and shopkeepers into combat against professional killers. Some of these good people would probably die because of decisions she had made, and that knowledge would haunt her regardless of the ultimate outcome. "Martha, if something happens to me tonight, I want you to know that Thomas Running Bear is a good man who was falsely accused. Don't let anyone claim he was a criminal or a savage. He's risking his life to protect people he barely knows." Martha studied Sarah's face in the dim starlight, reading emotions that went far beyond concern for an innocent man's reputation. "You love him, don't you?" Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks despite the cool night air. "Yes, I do. More than I ever thought possible." "Then you fight to get back to him, and don't you dare give up no matter how bad things look. Love like that doesn't come along often, especially in a place like this." The simple advice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom, and Sarah found herself drawing strength from Martha's matter-of-fact acceptance of her feelings. Frontier communities understood that happiness was precious and fragile, to be protected at any cost. A flash of light from the northern hills interrupted their conversation, followed seconds later by the sound of rifle fire. The signal Sarah had been waiting for, confirming that Black Eagle's Apache warriors had engaged Coulter's remaining forces in the diversionary battle Thomas had planned. "That's it," Sarah whispered, her heart beginning to race with anticipation and terror. "Send word to Henderson. It's time." Martha disappeared down the stairs to relay the message, leaving Sarah alone with her telescope and the awesome responsibility of coordinating the defense of an entire community. Through the lens, she could see movement among Coulter's positions as the men reacted to the unexpected attack on their comrades. The church bell rang once, then twice, then 3 times in the pattern Henderson had established to signal the beginning of their counterattack. Across the settlement, men emerged from concealment and began moving toward predetermined positions, their weapons glinting in the starlight. Sarah watched through her telescope as the first phase of their plan unfolded. The strangers who had infiltrated the settlement during the day found themselves suddenly isolated and outnumbered as armed townspeople converged on their positions. Brief struggles erupted at the trading post and near the livery stable, but the element of surprise gave the defenders crucial advantages. On the surrounding hills, Coulter's remaining sentries began responding to the commotion in the settlement, but their reactions were confused and uncoordinated. They had expected to be hunting helpless victims, not defending against organized resistance from multiple directions. The sound of sustained gunfire erupted from the eastern ridge as Henderson's group engaged the enemy position overlooking the main road. Sarah could see muzzle flashes winking in the darkness as both sides exchanged volleys, but the townspeople's intimate knowledge of the local terrain allowed them to use cover more effectively than their opponents. A sudden commotion in the street below drew Sarah's attention away from the distant fighting. 3 riders were approaching the church at a gallop, their horses lathered with sweat and their clothes torn by desperate travel through rough country. Even in the darkness, Sarah recognized the massive figure leading the group. Thomas had returned, bringing 2 of his fellow hunters with him after successfully completing their part of the diversionary plan. Sarah felt relief flood through her as she confirmed that the man she loved had survived the initial phases of their desperate gambit. She climbed down from the bell tower as quickly as the narrow stairs allowed, reaching the church entrance just as Thomas dismounted from his exhausted horse. Without thinking about propriety or the presence of witnesses, Sarah ran to him and threw herself into his arms. "Thank God you're safe," she whispered against his chest, feeling the solid reality of his presence after hours of uncertainty and fear. Thomas held her tightly for a moment, his own relief evident in the way his arms encircled her protectively. "The diversionary attack succeeded beyond our hopes," he reported quickly. "Black Eagle's warriors have engaged the main body of Coulter's force in the canyons, and most of the enemy sentries have been drawn away from the settlement. What about Coulter himself?" Thomas's expression grew grim. "He escaped the initial ambush and is probably heading here with whatever men he can gather. We may have reduced his numbers, but he's still extremely dangerous." Sarah nodded, understanding that their success so far was only the beginning of what would likely be a much longer and more brutal confrontation. Coulter had invested too much in his plans to abandon them easily, and desperate men often proved more dangerous than confident ones. Henderson appeared from the direction of the trading post, his clothes torn and a fresh bandage visible on his left arm. "Miss Mitchell, we've secured the immediate area and captured 3 of Coulter's men who were hiding in town. But we're receiving reports of riders approaching from the south." Sarah felt her stomach tighten as she realized their brief respite was ending. The final confrontation was approaching, and everything they had accomplished so far would be meaningless if they couldn't hold their positions against Coulter's last desperate assault. "How many riders?" Thomas asked, his hand moving automatically to check his rifle. "At least 8, possibly more. They're moving fast and making no attempt at concealment." Thomas turned to his 2 companions and spoke rapidly in Apache. The hunters nodded and melted away into the darkness, heading toward positions that would allow them to provide covering fire during the approaching battle. "Sarah," Thomas said, his voice carrying both tenderness and urgency, "you should join the other women in the church basement. What's coming next will be the most dangerous part of the entire night." Sarah shook her head firmly, surprising herself with the determination in her voice. "I'm not hiding while good people fight for their lives. This community trusted my judgment enough to risk everything, and I won't abandon them now." Thomas studied her face in the starlight, clearly reading the resolve that had replaced her earlier uncertainty. "Then stay close to me and follow my lead exactly. Professional gunfighters are different from the men we've faced so far." The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied by the kind of wild shouting that suggested riders who had abandoned caution in favor of speed and fury. Sarah could see torch flames dancing in the darkness as Coulter's remaining force thundered toward the settlement. "Positions!" Henderson called out, his voice carrying across the area around the church. Men who had been ordinary shopkeepers and farmers just hours earlier took cover behind wagons, water troughs, and whatever other shelter they could find. Sarah found herself crouched behind a stone fence with Thomas beside her, his rifle trained on the main approach to the settlement. His calm competence helped steady her nerves as the sound of riders grew increasingly loud and threatening. The attack came with the sudden fury of a summer thunderstorm. Coulter's men charged into the settlement, firing wildly, their horses' hooves throwing up clouds of dust that made accurate shooting difficult for both sides. But the defenders had prepared well, and coordinated fire from multiple positions caught the attackers in a deadly crossfire. 2 riders fell immediately, their horses rearing and screaming in confusion as gunfire erupted from every direction. The surviving attackers wheeled their mounts and sought cover, but the open ground of the main street provided little protection against defenders who knew every inch of their territory. Sarah found herself shooting methodically with her brother's revolver, amazed by her own steadiness under conditions that should have left her paralyzed with terror. Each shot was carefully aimed, and she felt grim satisfaction when she saw one of Coulter's men fall from his horse after her bullet found its mark. Behind the water trough, Thomas called out, pointing toward a position where several riders had taken cover. His rifle spoke with authority, and Sarah saw one of the hidden figures jerk and fall backward. The battle raged for perhaps 10 minutes, though it felt like hours to Sarah. Gradually, the volume of fire from Coulter's positions diminished as the defenders' superior numbers and better cover took their toll. But the fighting was far from over. A new sound cut through the gunfire, the distinctive war cry of Apache warriors approaching from the north. Black Eagle's men had completed their engagement in the canyons and were arriving to participate in the final phase of the battle. The psychological effect on Coulter's remaining men was immediate and devastating. Already outnumbered and outfought by the townspeople, they now faced the prospect of combat against some of the most skilled warriors in the American West. "Surrender," Henderson called out from his position near the trading post. "You're surrounded and outnumbered. Throw down your weapons and you'll be treated fairly." For a moment, Sarah thought the offer might be accepted. The gunfire had stopped, and an eerie silence settled over the settlement as both sides waited to see what would happen next. Then Jake Coulter himself appeared, rising from cover behind an overturned wagon with a rifle in his hands and fury contorting his features. His pale eyes swept the area until they fixed on Thomas with unmistakable hatred. "This isn't over, Running Bear," Coulter screamed, his voice cracking with rage and desperation. "You think you've won, but there are more of us coming. We'll burn this entire territory before we let you savages interfere with progress." Thomas rose slowly from behind the stone fence, his rifle held ready but not immediately threatening. "It's over, Coulter. Your men are dead or captured, and your employers will disavow any knowledge of your actions here. Surrender while you still can." Coulter's response was to raise his rifle toward Thomas, but he never had the chance to fire. Sarah's revolver spoke first, her bullet taking the outlaw leader in the chest and spinning him backward into the dust of the street. The silence that followed was complete and profound, broken only by the distant sound of approaching Apache warriors and the nervous whickering of horses. Sarah stared at the fallen figure of Jake Coulter, hardly believing that she had been the one to end his threat permanently. Thomas moved to her side and gently took the smoking revolver from her trembling hands. "It's finished," he said quietly. "You did what had to be done." Black Eagle and his warriors arrived as the townspeople began emerging from cover to assess the aftermath of the battle. The Apache leader was a man of perhaps 40 years, with intelligent eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. He surveyed the scene with obvious satisfaction before approaching Thomas and Sarah. The conversation that followed was conducted primarily in Apache, but Sarah caught enough words to understand that Black Eagle was reporting the complete destruction of Coulter's operation. The men who had been hunting Thomas were either dead or fled, and the larger conspiracy they represented had been effectively dismantled. Black Eagle says that Coulter's employers will probably abandon their plans for this region, Thomas translated. For Sarah, too much attention has been drawn to their methods, and territorial authorities will be forced to investigate. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion as the full implications of their victory began to sink in. They had not only survived the immediate threat, but had struck a blow against the larger forces of exploitation and violence that threatened frontier communities throughout the territory. Henderson approached them as the cleanup of the battlefield began. "Miss Mitchell, I want you to know that what you did tonight saved this entire community. Without your warning and leadership, we would have been completely helpless against these men." Sarah felt tears threatening as she looked around at the faces of people she had come to love during her brief time in Riverside Bend. Ordinary farmers and shopkeepers, who had shown extraordinary courage when circumstances demanded it. Women like Martha, who had protected the vulnerable while their men fought for everyone's survival. "Mr. Henderson, these people saved themselves through their own courage and determination. I just helped them understand what they were fighting for." Thomas placed his hand gently on Sarah's shoulder, his touch conveying support and affection that needed no words. "What will you do now?" he asked quietly. "Will you stay in Riverside Bend, or do you feel called to return to your previous life?" Sarah looked up into his dark eyes, seeing infinite possibilities reflected in their depths. The proper Philadelphia schoolteacher she had been just days earlier seemed like a stranger from another lifetime. The woman she had become through love and adversity was someone she barely recognized but deeply respected. "I think my teaching days in a traditional classroom are probably over," she said with a smile that felt completely natural for the first time in months. "But I have learned there are many different ways to educate people and help communities grow." Thomas's answering smile transformed his entire face, revealing depths of warmth and affection that took Sarah's breath away. "I hunt buffalo because it provides for my people and keeps me connected to the land of my ancestors. But I have discovered that the most important hunt of my life has been successful beyond my wildest dreams." "What hunt was that?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "The hunt for a heart that could understand mine. The hunt for a love strong enough to bridge any differences between peoples or backgrounds." Thomas paused, then continued with simple directness that made her pulse race. "I hunt buffalo, but I have been hunting your heart, and I find that you have been hunting mine with equal success." Sarah felt tears of joy rather than sorrow as she stepped into Thomas's embrace, surrounded by friends who had become family through shared danger and triumph. The massive Apache brave who had seemed so remote and untouchable had indeed captured her heart completely. Just as she had captured his, the future that stretched before them would undoubtedly bring new challenges and adventures, but they would face whatever came together. Two people from different worlds who had found in each other the courage to create something entirely new. As dawn began to break over the Montana plains, painting the grassland in shades of gold and rose, Sarah Mitchell and Thomas Running Bear began planning a life that would honor both their backgrounds while creating new possibilities for understanding between peoples who had too often seen each other as enemies. The buffalo herds would continue their ancient migrations across the territory, and Thomas would continue to hunt them when necessity required. But his most important and successful hunt was now complete, having found not just love, but a partner worthy of the devotion he had never dared hope to offer. Up next, you have got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you will not want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.